Sitting here at the big table with me are two true transatlanticists to help us read through last night's speech. I'm happy to welcome to the day Nicole Renvert from the German Council on Foreign Relations, and to her right, Julius von der Laar, a campaign strategist and a veteran of the 2008 and 2012 Barack Obama campaigns. To both of you, welcome. Well, what a night it was. What did you both bet on before this speech? Let me ask you that. Did you think we were going to get a Twitter Trump or a teleprompter Trump?
Well, I was hoping for a Twitter Trump.
You were hoping for a Twitter Trump?
Right, because the speech was rather conventional.
Oh, okay. What did you say, Julius?
I think it was in the spirit of Davos from last week, but again, it had a couple of good lines in there.
What would you say was the highlight of the speech?
The highlight, of course, was the authentic Trump praising himself, being the ultimate cheerleader, but most importantly, being the ultimate cheerleader for himself.
From Europe's point of view, what kind of speech was this?
Well, it was a speech where Europe didn't take place. I mean, you mentioned it. There was no mentioning of the alliance, of transatlantic partnership. There was no mentioning of the peace process in the Middle East. And so it was a non-European speech.
Julius, what did you think about that? I mean, the fact that Europe was not mentioned once. That was a shocker to a lot of people. A lot of people said, you know, what did you expect?
That certainly didn't shock me. Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, whoever wrote the speech, I don't think they thought about Europe even once writing it. They clearly had their eyes focused on the base, but also reaching out above the base to make sure that they get their approval ratings, which are completely underwater.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the lead-in that they're around 37%. They have to get those approval ratings out. And right now, with the economy booming, with the Dow Jones performing, with Trump being able to push through his tax reform, you know, he's able to sell that and say to people, look, are you better off under my first year in office than you were for a long time? And I think that's the strategy, how they're going to try to make sure that they do at least decently well during the midterms and lay out a strategy in order to win in 2020.
Yeah, I think they're betting on a little bit of an approvals bump, right, which usually comes after the first State of the Union address. What about the Russian cloud, though, that is supposedly hanging over the White House? I want you to listen to what the president said, or maybe what he didn't say. Take a listen.
As we rebuild America's strength and confidence at home, we are also restoring our strength and standing abroad. Around the world, we face rogue regimes, terrorist groups, and rivals like China and Russia that challenge our interests, our economy, and our values.
Julius, let me ask you, is there a strategy behind omitting the Russian investigation from the State of the Union speech?
In my opinion, there clearly is. I mean, first of all, how are you going to not mention that if there's a federal investigation going on with Robert Mueller's special counsel, if Congress has passed sanctions, and just a day or two before the State of the Union, this president pretty much said, well, he's not going to enact them.
He didn't mention that either.
He didn't mention that either, of course. So I think the strategy is clear. Donald Trump, the Republicans, are trying to muddy the waters and clearly drag down the FBI and the confidence in the FBI and the federal government in order to make sure that it's just, you know, so muddied down that people are not going to be able to differentiate in who's right and who's not.
And Nicole, how do you explain that to people here in Europe when they're looking at the leader of the United States, who, in one of his most important speeches, does not even mention the reality of the Russian threat, be it cyber or be it to NATO, whatever? How do you explain that?
Well, he talked about all kinds of other things, and the very long talk he gave basically focused mainly on an audience in the United States. Yeah, and so by focusing on his success, for example, in the economic sphere, even though not all the facts were right, he very much gave the impression of that he's now a real president. He's taking care of the people. He looks out for Americans, and this is how he also defined his foreign policy agenda. He will put the interests of the American people first, and therefore there was no need for him to really look out for, you know, the allies.
But is that something new, though? We've had other presidents who have also had an America First policy. They just called it something differently, but they've always mentioned the allies. I mean, this is a complete omission, as if the partners and the allies didn't exist. That's new, isn't it?
Well, it's not so new when you look at, how the last year developed, because from the very start, his foreign policy was a give and take kind of policy. And in this respect, in the speech, he also outlined, where he sees potential for cooperation, and where he doesn't see potential for cooperation, he wouldn't just mention it.
Yeah, it's all about the transaction.
Well, and he mentioned issues like Iran, the Iran deal. He mentioned again North Korea as one of the biggest challenges for him, and of course he also mentioned building the wall. So he basically referred to many of the things he wanted to achieve in the last year, or the things he still has on his agenda for next year.
If I may, the interesting aspect is that everything was just so vague.
That's right.
I mean, he talked about infrastructure from a domestic policy perspective, that he wants to spend, a lot of money, 1.5 billion, trillion on
infrastructure. He didn't say
infrastructure.
spend, though.
Well, of course, he doesn't say spend.
He said he
it's a
wanted to
tax report,
generate 1.5 trillion.
Right.
But there's a big difference between generate and spend, right?
Well, in the end, it's going to add to the deficit. And I think you saw Paul Ryan almost sitting in a hostage video behind there, where he's just saying, well, I don't know how he's going to actually pay for that. It's just going to add to the 20 trillion deficit. So that's the one thing. But what I wanted to get at is, there were a couple of lofty ideas. For one, he talked about nuclear weapons, and wouldn't it be nice that if one day there wouldn't be any nuclear weapons? Right. At the same time, he wants to tear down the Iran deal. There was no mention of the START treaty. All those aspects, it was like lofty goals, but no policy
we're not there
on how
yet.
to get there.
Yeah. Let's talk about immigration for a moment. I spoke to our Washington correspondent, Carolina Chamoy, earlier about Trump and the Dreamers in his speech. Take a listen. Carolina, you've reported numerous times on the immigration debate in the U.S., especially the generation of immigrants who came to the U.S. as children known as Dreamers. Last night, Trump said that he wanted to work with both parties to give Dreamers a path to citizenship. His offer did not go down well with everyone. Take a listen.
Under our plan, we focus on the immediate family by limiting sponsorships to spouses and minor children. My duty, and the sacred duty of every elected official in this chamber, is to defend Americans, to protect their safety, their families, their communities, and their right to the American dream. Because Americans are dreamers too.
Carolina, we know that the disagreement over the future of these Dreamers, it's already led to one government shutdown. It could lead to another one in 2 weeks' time. Has progress been made?
Hello, Brent. Well, not really, because Donald Trump underlined again his proposal for offering the U.S. citizenship to 1.8 million undocumented migrants, but only in exchange to the financing of his U.S.-Mexican border wall. Also, under the condition of ending the green card lottery and limiting the family reunification for the ones who already have a green card for the United States. He calls it the migration chain. And this is a very important topic, the migration plan he proposed yesterday, because as he already mentioned, the next deadline for the shutdown is the 8th of February. It's not even 2 weeks. The immigration policy is probably the most important bargain chip that we're going to see and we're going to hear during the next week. And experts are commenting here that some Democrats might accept a partial financing of the wall, which could end up in a scandal among the Democrats, since they have always assured they are not going to accept the wall under any circumstances. But remember, Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, said a week ago during his speech in the Senate that he would consider to discuss a border wall as part of a Trump deal. And he did during his meeting with Donald Trump. But apparently this wasn't enough compromise for the president, because after this meeting, the White House released a proposal with the points I already mentioned.
And what about that statement last night by the U.S. president when he said, because Americans are dreamers too?
Well, Brent, this was again a message to his base, of course. You can see very positive reactions on this comment, on this statement of Donald Trump, because he refers again directly to America first, Americans first, American citizens first. But in a way, it's a bit contradictory and confusing too, because dreamers say exactly that. They do feel like Americans. They grew up here, they speak the language, they went here to school, to university, they work here. So they told me they will probably change the slogan and say, well, yes, Americans are dreamers, but dreamers are Americans too.
Yeah, it just proves how much language matters in this debate. Our correspondent, Carolina Chamoy, on the story for us tonight in Washington. Carolina, thank you very much. All right, back here at the big table, let me ask both of you as Europeans, what does that sentence mean to you that Trump said? Americans are dreamers too.
Well, we would hope that he means that Americans also want to live want to have a life with dignity. They want to have an income so they can, have a family and have a job. But that, I think, should also mean he defines who he thinks Americans are.
And that's the key, right? Do we know or do we not know who he means?
A lot of people, in reaction to the speech, has said, this is the unifying president. This is someone who actually wants to bring people together. I'd argue that this was one of the moments where he's exactly doing what he's always been doing, is pitting people against each other. Americans are dreamers, too. This is all of a sudden, again, us versus them, or our future is more important than those others. And so I think that's how he's framed that debate. And again, if we look at the families in Ohio, his base, I think that's how he's trying to win that argument. And in the end, saying that Democrats are in favor of people who are not us. And that's how he's going to frame it.
That's how it seems to have been spun. Exactly right. Let's turn it now to North Korea and the use of guests who were sitting in the gallery last night. Last night, the president used, stories of tragedy and personal strength to talk about how to deal with the menace of the hermit kingdom. Now, we had the American Otto Warmbier, who was kept in North Korea. He was returned to the U.S. He later died. His parents were in the gallery last night, sobbing, obviously mourning. And they were not the only guests. Take a look.
He woke up as a train ran over his limbs. He then endured multiple amputations without anything to dull the pain or the hurt. But Sung-ho, I understand you still keep those old crutches as a reminder of how far you've come. Please, thank you.
I mean, there he is holding up the crutches. Obviously, a compelling picture. Did the U.S. president, did he use personal tragedy to build political capital in that moment?
It's a very emotional story if somebody comes and shows, what happened to him. And the picture he paints, of course, is the picture of victims, which, appeals to people's emotions. So he does this in a very smart way. And in doing this, he, prepares people to think even worse of North Korea, and how to deal with that. So is he preparing? Some commentators today said that they felt that speech was preparing the nation for some type of conflict. Did you get that impression with that?
I mean, I think that is an option. I wouldn't read too much into the fact whether it's going to preparing the nation for conflict. Yeah. But picking those personal anecdotes and those personal tragedies that people went through, they were strategically picked for every section of the speech. For immigration, it was the question of MS-13, and of course,
gang violence.
Gang violence, and he had some of the families who were victims of gang violence up there. And of course, that was also in order to frame the immigration debate as a national security issue. Right. And so every time, every new policy issue that was introduced, it was for building infrastructure. Well, there was somebody up there working.
But why do you think the Democrats, that's a good point. There was nothing said about gun violence in the U.S. There was nothing said about the shooting in Las Vegas, the biggest in U.S. history, right. Mass killing, and which, of course, was committed by what? An American. And yet he said nothing about that. Why do you not see the Democrats seizing on those facts to reply to the president. I mean, it's been mute.
Right. I mean, we did see Mr. Kennedy's rebuttal speech, which was highly praised, and I think rightfully so. But again, you can't stand up to the president on the State of the Union night. There's never been a rebuttal by anyone that even got close to the president standing in front of both chambers of Congress. And so he's got the ultimate stage. Nobody can live up to that. And I think Donald Trump did masterfully take those personal stories, just like President Obama did in his State of the Union, to drive a narrative. The question is, and we've seen that polls do go up slightly for a day or two, unless, of course, you have a strategic rollout of a policy and actually go out and campaign now for days, which I don't think Donald Trump is
not going to do.
Is probably not going to do.
Before we run out, let me just ask you, before we run out, we've seen the speech in Davos and we had the State of the Union last night. Europe is looking at this, and you've got these two camps now. We stick with the U.S. and just grin and bear it, or we realize we can't rely on the U.S. anymore because of Trump. Which camp is going to be stronger now after these two speeches?
I mean, Europe is, again, in the position that it can't really choose either or. We have this very strong dependencies on the U.S. And I think the speech somehow made people believe, well, finally, maybe, he comes around, he will be a good president. But the fear that what he says in the State of the Union has very little to do with reality is still there. And if you look at the facts, for example, he threatened that he will do something about North Korea if they cross a certain line.
Right.
It's something where he has to deliver. It's not a good thing. But if he makes these announcements, he will be held accountable for his actions.
Yeah.
And I very much believe that people look at the speech quite closely, and the reaction and the analysis, what does it really mean in reality, will come in the next few weeks, months, where we see what will happen in the U.S.
You agree? 30 seconds.
There might be a tweet tomorrow morning, and we'll forget all about the speech. That is an option as well. And I think the way we should look at this goes back to values. Is it just going to be the economy that we're focused on, and can we make a quick buck of it? Or do we keep in mind all the things that Donald Trump has said during this first year as well?
Yeah, good point. Nicole Renvert and Julius von der Laar, to both of you, thank you for coming and sitting at the big table and helping us read through that speech. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.